Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. My name is Jim. I am joined by Jared. And this episode, we are going to discuss the DNA of a rebuild. And we're going to talk about the Washington Commanders. And we might get into the Houston Texans. But we're going to start with the Washington Commanders. And I think the thing to point out is that the Commanders in 2023, losing record, drafted in the top 10, and they've drafted in the top 10. They literally, I think, had the third overall pick.
Yep.
And they've turned it around. They're looking like a playoff team here in 2024. So Jared and I are just going to kind of debate, counterpoint, go back and forth a little bit on what we think the Commanders rebuild look like. So Jared, what would be maybe one or two things that you think would be important to start the discussion with?
I think the major two things that I think kind of really invigorated this entire rebuild is mainly one, pro scouting. Like, I think the Commanders had a really good offseason. If you ignore the draft, if you just look at the pieces they brought in, they really made sure to get players that played in the league that had roles that they could play immediately to help win games, create a good environment for a young quarterback to succeed in. And I think the second thing is they developed a scheme where the pieces that they have available to them fit very well within it, right? And they're kind of not doing the whole you draft a quarterback and try to tailor them to fit what you're trying to do. It's more you're trying to tailor yourself toward what their skill set kind of applies. And I kind of can get into that later on with the statistics involving the offense with Jaden Daniels versus previously.
So I will reiterate some of what you said. So one of the things that impressed me about the Commanders rebuild is just look at some of their free agent signings. And like you said, they didn't just bring in guys. These are guys that I think most fans would know who Austin Eckler and Bobby Wagner are.
Yeah.
Right. They're bringing in guys that can contribute. Wagner is not the player that he was 5 years ago. But if you've got a lot of rookies coming in, you need that 30-plus-year-old veteran in the locker room. Right. So, that's the kind of role that a Bobby Wagner or a Marcus Mariota fit. The Redskins, look at that. The Commanders did need a tight end, and they brought in Zach Ertz. Again, Zach Ertz is not the tight end he used to be, but he's still a legit NFL tight end, and a tight end is one of the toughest positions to develop. So even though the Commanders drafted a tight end, the guy that you draft at tight end isn't going to be ready until 3 years later. So you need to bring in somebody until the rookie that you draft is ready. And then Dante Fowler and Jeremy Chin would be two additional free agents that stand out to me. There's a longer list of free agents, but I think I'm trying to count because I didn't number them on my list. But it looks to be about 10 free agents, but none of them broke the bank, which is also one of the things I think is the DNA of a rebuild.
Yeah.
It's not a single big free agent signing. They brought in many.
Yeah, I also feel one of the major things that's not even just being brought up on is that they made some pretty clear efforts to fix holes that were gaping holes last year for the team. I think one of the major ones was special teams. Last year they had Cheeseman, I forgot his name, but he's an odd name. He was a drafted long snapper under the Ron Rivera era, and he was just terrible. And they brought in I think it was Tyler Ott, who's been a starting caliber long snapper, which is that's not a very sexy position to really have, but long snapper is one of those things where it's if you have a solid one, you will always be happy with it because you only really notice long snappers when something terrible happens, right? And if you see recently what's been going on with the special teams, for the past couple of years, the Commanders have had some major issues with kicking. Joey Sly's had some major issues with consistency, and a big reason for that is the snaps are going really high or really low which kind of affects like the kicking process. And what we're seeing now is that like the guy they picked up off the street, like Seibert, has been really consistent and like historically has not been that. And I think one of the major things is that getting this long snapper in and actually getting like a long snapper that can actually long snap at the NFL was such a huge addition for them, because now their special team unit has gone from like one of the worst in the league to like startable. And I think that's a huge addition to kind of like mention. And there's also been like a host of other players that they maintained that kind of do that same role. Like last year, Jeremy Reeves was a like Pro Bowl say like special teams player. They signed him for like $3 million a year, like for like 2 years, which is an amazing deal to get. I think they might have Pittman still, with a linebacker for the Lions, who's also a really good special teams player. I'm not sure if he's still on the team, but I remember that was a signing because I'm a Lions fan. We did see that. And then also they have a lot of like, they also have a guy they picked up from Miami who originally was supposed to be like this gunner and punt coverage player, and like Noah, like Abena, I can't pronounce his last name, but he was a first round pick from Miami, massive draft bust. But he's not only turned into like a very good special teams player for them, but he's like been their third corner and has been like a really good player for them. And I'm sure he's not going to be starting now with the recent addition of not Lattimore. Is it Lattimore? The Saints cornerback.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was just traded to the Commanders this year.
Yeah.
Right?
I think he's probably going to be seeing more special teams play as his main role, but that's still an awesome addition. Hell, with how St. Juice is playing, I would not be shocked if Juice is benched for Noah, because Noah's been playing great. And that's such a low addition signing. And I think you kind of mentioned this in that all of these additions that they're getting in this offseason have been like pretty low risk, high reward. If you really think about like what their value was, like Austin Eckler is being paid $4 million a year for 2 years. And he has like almost like 1,000 scrimmage yards already, right? On like kickoff duties, receiving duties, and like running duties. And that's value in the fourth for like $4 million. Like Bobby Wagner has like 85 tackles. That's value for like what is like a $7 million contract. And then if you look at like the other players they got from other teams, like Biotish is a good center, and they got him for like $10 million a year. That's a good contract for him. Dorrance Armstrong has been like a little disappointing, but like a good starting edge player for $11 million is like fine. But Dante Fowler, for the contract that they got him for, has been absurdly good. He's having a contract year when he's like 30. He's like 8 sacks or something like that. It's ridiculous. Like, I think just like getting these players for like such a good value has been like the essence of this rebuild.
So, and I think a key to success in the NFL is to have players outplay the value of their contract. Okay, so if you sign a quarterback for $40 million, you're expecting to get better than $40 million worth of performance, right? The key is for any player to outperform their contract. So the easiest way to do that is to have players on their first contract. It's more likely a player in their first 4 years is going to outplay the value of their contract than a veteran, which is signing at a market rate. Okay. But to Jared's point, the free agent signings were moderate contracts. The Commanders weren't signing players that were going to reset the market for the position that they made a free agent signing. Another thing the Commanders did is they gutted the roster. So if you were to compare the 2023 Commanders roster to the 2024 Commanders roster, do you know how many players are still on the team from 1 year to the next?
I don't know the number, but I do know for the fact that like I think out of like
23, I believe.
23.
When I counted, it was 23.
That's crazy. I remember like for last year's draft class, they only have 2 of the rookies that they had. I think it's literally just their first rounder from last year out of Mississippi State, Forbes, and I think it's like one of their edge players, and everyone else is off the team.
So when I went through a lot of times when I'm looking at like the DNA of a rebuild and even the DNA of a championship team, you're generally going to be a successful team if you have first of all, a new coach gets to pick their players. So the Commanders change their coach. So when the Commanders change their coach, they're basically getting rid of the players that the former GM and coach left them, right? They're only keeping the guys that they want. So in both the case with the Texans and the Commanders, one team kept 22 players and the other team kept 23. And that's out of a 53-man roster, which means that there were 30 new players as part of the rebuild in both teams. So if we're looking or trying to identify what is the DNA of a rebuild, some of it is gutting the roster. No matter how painful it is to gut the roster. What I mean by painful, you may carry a lot of dead cap, but if you're a new GM, you don't care. So I am a huge Buffalo Bills fan. And I can tell you that when Brandon Beane came in, Buffalo had to eat the contract of Mario Williams, Marcel Darius, and Buffalo in Brandon Beane's first year set a record for the amount of dead cap that a team carried. And that record was only broken by the Denver Broncos and Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
Right? So if we look at like the DNA of a rebuild, we got a new coach. We've talked about moderate free agent signings. And then you gut the roster. And we haven't even talked about the most important thing, and that's the Commanders drafted a quarterback that panned out.
Yeah.
Right? So Jaden Daniels appears to be the real deal.
I really like Daniels. I will say this, as someone that really covered the draft last year, I was not the biggest fan of him, but I think what they're doing in Washington to kind of like let him succeed is like they're doing what like ideal Jaden Daniels ball is, where it's a lot of scrambling, it's a lot of the short game, and then every once in a while, once you're given the opportunity, you uncork a deep ball, and the dude is amazing down the field. And I think it's showing like it's kind of what I mentioned earlier. I think Jaden Daniels is playing like very, very well. I think he's been the best rookie, period, and I think he's going to be the runaway favorite for Offensive Rookie of the Year. But I think if you like kind of look at the coaching situations at like let's say like the Bears, for example, versus Washington, I think if you look at like how they're kind of like cultivating their quarterbacks, it's such a huge difference because it's like the little things. Like one of the major things I've noticed is that a lot of like the shifting and line duties, like IDing or like recognizing if there's like a blitz, it's not Daniels' duty for that. It's a lot of it's Cosmi. Like Cosmi's doing a lot of the IDing at guard, and that's like a huge thing to have there because suddenly this young quarterback that has to learn a playbook, how to like beat certain disguised coverages, how to like basically be an NFL quarterback, no longer really has to like worry about like, hey, is my protection the right protection against this front? That's an entire thing he just doesn't have to worry about anymore. And Cosmi is going to be here for the next like 4 years on a large extension. So presumably for his rookie contract, Daniels doesn't have to worry about that at all, right? And then if you look at like the rest of it, it's like the line still is bad, but they're playing like one of the major things I kind of noticed with coaching that was a big addition is that they're like 11th in the league in 12 personnel. Last year, they were like bottom 10. They're now like they're essentially top 10 and like 12 personnel. A big reason for that is chip help. Like they know for a fact that if you put Cornelius Lucas or their rookie Brendan Coleman and then also Andrew Wiley out there against most good to great pass rushers in this league, you're going to get pressures. And when you get pressures, bad things happen. But they know for a fact that, okay, if we give chip help, it will give Daniels enough time to at least scramble or create like a non-negative play. And I think just realizing that where you're like, okay, we have this dynamic playmaker quarterback and we have this bad line. If we just buy him time to then just make a play by himself and trusting that, they can have a great offense. And we're seeing that happen. Like Daniels is leading the league in scramble percentage still. And the offense is ridiculously effective because the dude is like arguably the second best running athlete at the position besides Lamar. And I think that is such a huge addition to that offense. It's just like creating the pieces to allow Daniels to play his style of football in the best way possible.
So going back to that 12 personnel, so we talked about Zach Ertz as a free agent signing. One of their draft picks was a tight end. And I know from the draft circles, everybody was screaming that when I was mocking for the Commanders, I always had to pick a tight end, right? If you showed a mock draft to the Commanders without a tight end, you usually got a little bit of feedback on social media about it. Mm-hmm. So if you have the personnel to run 12, you can run it, but you need 2 tight ends, which the Commanders do. And one other anatomy, so Jared, like you had mentioned, you compared the Commanders to the Bears. So if we were to compare, and we're going to try not to hate too much, but let's talk about what the DNA of a rebuild looks like, right? So we changed coaches in Washington, and we drafted a new quarterback in Washington. And if you look at teams like New England did that, New England changed coaches and they drafted a quarterback. The Bears drafted a quarterback, but they didn't change coaches. So you can learn things from if your team has to turn it around fast. So if you're expecting your team to go into the 2025 draft and come out a playoff team, what does that look like? Well, you probably are going to have a new coach. You'll probably want a new GM. Okay. Here's a good one. You want to be in the same division as the Commanders or the Texans.
It's fair.
Okay. Right? Because is New England going to be able to turn it around in a year when they're in a division with Buffalo?
I will say New England's looked a lot better in the past 5 weeks of May starting. The offense, I think it's crazy. I think right now they actually have for the first time in 2 seasons, they have a positive EPA per play per drop back. They're not whenever they pass, they're not actively losing games, which is a big addition to have with May. I think right now out of the quarterbacks, I would say May and Daniels are playing the best. It's just May has played only a lot less games. He's played 5. But on what you're kind of talking about with the coaches, I would say I didn't hate I didn't hate keeping Eberflus, mainly because if you look at what Eberflus does, he was coaching a very good defense, and he's continued to coach a very good defense. The Bears defense has been really solid if you look at the personnel versus what they actually have been doing. Last year, pre-Sweat, he managed to get it to a point where it was around league average, and then after Sweat, he made it to a good defense. And after the additions in this offseason, maintaining certain guys, he was supposed to carry in a good defense, which is what he's done. I think the major issues we're having in Chicago is that they made the wrong hire at offensive coordinator. I think the Waldron signing as a whole is baffling to me, because generally whenever you see an offensive coordinator get fired and then go sign somewhere else as an offensive coordinator, something bad has happened. Because generally when an offensive coordinator is off a team, it's for a head coaching job. So whenever that doesn't happen, that means something has gone awry. And if we have seen from the changes that Seattle has had versus the changes that the Bears have had with Waldron, it's oh, this guy is not great at his job. It's the reason they literally removed play calling duties from him already. It's
right. And we are recording this on the day that Waldron got fired.
Yeah. Is he fired? Is he just removed from play calling duties?
No, he was fired.
Fired. Wow.
He was fired today. Yeah. So this is being recorded on the day that Chicago fired their offensive coordinator. But going back in to say, what are the positive steps an organization needs to make to turn it around quickly? You're going to need to be willing to take salary cap pain the first year that you come in. So if and I'm a big believer in a lot of GMs know whether or not they're on a hot seat, because if they're on a hot seat, they might trade draft assets, and that can keep them around another year. And the reason why that would be true is that does a GM want to come in? For example, does a GM want to come in and take over the Saints? Probably not, because literally it's going to be 2 years of cap pain.
Yeah.
Right. So, but looking then, flipping it back to the Commanders as to what some of the things is, they're in a division that isn't that strong. Okay. Now, there's going to be Cowboys fans that listen to this podcast and tell me that I'm full of stuff. But I'm going to say the Cowboys, with 3 straight 12-win seasons, something about that as an outsider never looked right. And granted, they were in a division with the Commanders and the Giants, relatively weak. Philadelphia is having an off year, but I think Philadelphia is having some coaching issues, right? Like if I have to pick like 5 coaches that are on the hot seat, Philadelphia's coach is one of the 5. Right. So the Commanders are in the right division. And just because the Commanders are good this year doesn't mean they're going to sustain success. It just means that they were able to rebuild and retool the roster fast, likely getting a playoff berth, but being able to sustain multiple playoff berths is different than successfully rebuilding a team. Right? Like to me, one doesn't imply the other.
Yeah.
So
I will say one thing that I've noticed is kind of interesting. We're looking at the Texans and the Commanders. So like, I think this big thing we always hear about with like a quarterback, like a team that drafts quarterback is like, oh, get an offensive coach and then staple that offensive coach onto the quarterback. Like that's what we always hear. Like I think like when the Quinn hire happened, people were like, oh, why did you not get like, I don't know, like Ben Johnson, for example? Like why? He just didn't take interviews, but like why didn't you get like an offensive guy? And I think what we're seeing here is that like because the league is so offensively focused, there's a lot of damn good defensive coordinators that should be head coaches somewhere, but they're not because the league is trying to gear towards offense. And it leads to guys like DeMeco Ryans and Dan Quinn with opportunities where like they're going to these teams and then immediately turning around a defense. And I think that's a really big part of this like rebuild is that like the Commanders in 2023 were a bad defense. The Texans in 2022 were a bad defense. Like the Texans that year was like, I think either the worst or like the second worst at like letting up first downs. The Commanders that in 2023 was just like a dumpster fire on defense. And then suddenly you get a dude that can then run a scheme and get players to fit that scheme and do play calling duties on defense. And suddenly they turn it around where like the Commanders are like, I think right now, if you look at the statistics, now it's not like super accurate, but they're playing like a top 10 defense in the league. Going from like 32nd to top 10 is huge. And for the Texans in 2023, you're playing around like league average, which is huge because you're like the worst defense in the league. So if you like look at those big changes, I think that's also a very big thing we need to mention is like the kinds of hirings they're doing. Because I kind of have an argument where if a quarterback really hits and can really turn around an offense, which we're kind of seeing, I think hiring a defensive coach or having a defensive head coach is, I think, honestly better because they have more impact in changing an entire side of football instead of like hyper-focusing just on offense.
So one of the things that I will point out that is an underrated aspect of a coaching staff is the coaching staff has to be able to grow coaches. And I'm gonna go back to, again, I am a Bills fan. Okay. Sean McDermott needs to get a lot of credit for growing coaches. And here's what I mean by that. So Sean McDermott had Leslie Frazier coaching the defense. And Brian Daboll was not the offensive coordinator his first year, but Daboll came in McDermott's second year. And that would have been Josh Allen's rookie year. Okay. Daboll goes. Frazier goes. Replaced with Babich, replaced with Dorsey. Dorsey goes. Replaced with Brady. Okay. There's coaches coming up. Okay. Bobby Babich got a head coaching interview. Okay. And he hadn't even been the Bills' defensive coordinator yet. Right? So teams were interviewing Babich to be their head coach, and he wasn't even Buffalo's defensive coordinator. He was grown. And to me, this is how you sustain success in the NFL, because if you have a good coordinator, they're not going to be there long.
Yeah.
So that's how you sustain the rebuild. A coach has to be able to grow coaches. Okay? Look at the number of people that have coached with Bill Belichick. He did a good job of growing coaches. Those coaches didn't do so well when they left, but that didn't mean that Belichick didn't grow them. Right between Romeo Crennel, Josh McDaniel. I'm trying to think. The guy that went to Notre Dame, Charlie Weiss. There we go. Right. So there were, and then even Mike Vrabel.
Yeah.
Right. So there were multiple people that left the Patriots and became coaches. He grew coaches. And that's part of what sustained the Patriots. So part of what would sustain the Commanders or sustain the Texans, what's going to happen when Bobby Slovic leaves the Texans? Because he's going to be a head coach. So did Bobby Slovic grow somebody underneath him? Or was he just calling the plays? And, I mean, I think that's why fans clamor for an offensive head coach.
Yeah.
Is if you have an offensive head coach, the playbook isn't going to change. So there's some stability there. But what's more important is you got to know who the wide receiver coaches are or the quarterback's coach or some of these other position coaches, because they have to be able to grow the talent around them. And that's not the talent of the players. That's the knowledge and the talent of the coaches. And that doesn't get talked about very much. But that's part of what keeps a good team successful, according to me.
I mean, yeah, I think that's just the cost of being successful. Like, look at the Ravens last year. Their defense was like historically good. Like, damn near half their staff are like defensive coordinators right now, right? And I do agree with what you're saying, but I think also the same concept applies to like defensive coordinators for a long period of time. Like right now, the Cowboys are like a dumpster fire on defense. And I think a big part of it is like, is it a little bit talent? Yes. But like at the end of the day, you have the best defensive player or one of the best defensive players in football with Micah Parsons. You have a good secondary, right? Linebacker in the interior are not great, but like your edge rotation in your corner room are great. And like whenever Dan Quinn was in Dallas, they were like a top 10 defense pretty consistently. And before he arrived, they were like bottom 20. And now they're playing at a bottom 20 level right now. So I just think it's like, I do agree that like having any coordinator leave you leads to a lot of issues. I mean, look at the Eagles after their Super Bowl run. They lost both coordinators. They went just completely haywire the next season, right? I just think that it's going to happen. Like if you are good, you're going to lose guys, and how you adjust determines a lot about your continued success. And I think having a head coach that dominates one side of the ball is a way to fix that. Like it's a big reason why I'm not a big fan of like the CEO and like culture coaches. Like I love Dan Campbell. I'm a Lions fan, but I'm really scared about what's going to happen if we lose Ben Johnson, what happens to the offense. Right. Or like, if I'm like a Ravens head coach, he has a brother for Harbaugh. If I'm like Harbaugh, who's a kind of like a CEO style guy, and then I lose like a lot of my defensive staff. Suddenly the Ravens defense has not been playing great this season, when like last season they were playing like out of this world, right? And if you look at like Sirianni is also this like CEO type guy, loses both his coordinators, and then both sides of the ball the next season look way worse.
Well, and that leads to my point. So Sirianni didn't grow coaches, because your position coaches should be able to do the job of the game plan and what the coordinators do. And again, if you look, like McDermott's from the Andy Reid tree. So if people don't know that, McDermott coached under Andy Reid when they were in Philadelphia, right? Reid has grown a lot of coaches, right? So we've seen Matt Nagy, we've seen Eric Bieniemy go get jobs. And even if Bieniemy was in Washington for a year and then he went back to college, being able to grow coaches and be able to make sure that they can take on more responsibility makes it less needy for a offensive head coach to call plays or for a defensive coach to call plays. Right now, McDermott was Buffalo's defensive coordinator last year. McDermott was the one calling the defensive plays. He was the coach running the defensive meetings, right? So he always had to tell the players when he walked in, he says, I'm your defensive coordinator right now, not your head coach, right? So that way the players like had an open line of communication with him about what they were seeing on the field and things like that. So going back then to like, what is the anatomy of a rebuild? So my opinion is that there's going to be divisions that are easier to rebuild. So, for example, if Sirianni gets fired, it's going to be easier to go to Philadelphia and rebuild than it will be to go to the NFC West and rebuild. And that's because the division is weaker. According to me, I think the NFC East is weaker than the NFC West. So if you're taking over, let's say, like, take a look at Seattle, for example. They have a new head coach, to your point. But they got to get by the 49ers, who've been to the NFC Championship, for 2 of the last 3 years or 3 of the last 4 years, something like that. To be able to overtake that Goliath is difficult. The same way New England's probably not, even with changing head coaches and changing quarterbacks, is probably not getting by Buffalo. The other 3 teams in the AFC East are all drafting in the top 10. So if you haven't looked, Miami, the Jets, and the Patriots are all drafting in the top 10 right now in the draft order.
Yeah.
For 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just not a strong division. But you can have a Goliath at the top. When there is no Goliath, it's easier to rebuild. So to me, what is it? So for example, somebody taking over Chicago, you got to get by the Packers, the Vikings, and the Lions.
Yeah, I mean, the North.
You're probably not going to see a fast rebuild there, right? So the rebuild strategy might be different than if you're taking over the Panthers or the Saints. That's an easier division to succeed in because the division isn't really that good. Who's ever making the playoffs from the NFC South, right? Like, that team can change every year. The division itself isn't that strong yet.
I would say I do agree with the idea that, I think your placement in divisions does matter. Like, hey, if you're playing against the Chiefs 2 times of the year, that's not great because you're playing against Patrick Mahomes. But I think we have a certain level of parity in the sense that there's a lot of teams that are very average. I would say there's a couple dumpster fire teams right now, but there's not a lot, right? There's a couple really bad teams, and there's this big wave of mediocre that we're kind of seeing in the league where there's a lot more parity. And I think there's not really a ton of divisions, I would say, right now, besides the South, where there really is just an entire division of bad. I would say obviously the South is probably the weakest division in football, but every single team has frisky playoff contending teams, right? And I would say it's a situation where I do agree with the idea that yes, it probably makes the fast rebuild, quote unquote, more difficult, but also, is that really that valuable over just having more long-term extended success? I think if you're kind of looking at rebuilding a team, you've really got to think of about the future. Because I think initial success is great and all, and allows you to be aggressive for your second season. But I think it's also equally as important to maintain long presences in that division. I think what the Falcons are doing is also an equally valid way to rebuild their team, because odds are they're going to be probably the best or second best team in the division for the next 8 seasons because they have Penix cooking in the back, right? So I think that's also a thing we have to kind of mention is it really that valuable to kind of rebuild quickly? And I think that's actually an interesting thing to kind of discuss.
So,
because how many really successful teams really happened from a spark plug in one season? If you really think about it.
So, and this series will be expanded because actually, once I started putting some of the notes together, I said, well, we need to document what the Rams did. So if I had to add some teams to this list, the Rams are the 3rd team. How the Rams went to the Super Bowl, gutted the roster, and then made the playoffs last year. Sean McVay doesn't scout. If fans don't know this, it's all – is it Les Snead is the GM? I'd have to go look up who the Rams GM is.
The Rams draft weird, dude. Their technique is very odd.
Right. But Snead is the one doing that. Sean McVay likes tinkering with the offensive game plan or finding a way to use a player. But my understanding is he doesn't necessarily get as involved with the draft process. But here's my point. The Rams were in such bad salary cap position from what they did when they had to acquire Von Miller, and they kicked the can down the road on the Aaron Donald contract a couple times. So they were in some salary cap situations, so they had to get rid of a lot of players. They had to get rid of Leonard Floyd, Von Miller, Bobby Wagner, right? There was a long list. Even Jalen Ramsey they had to get rid of, right? So they had to get rid of all those players, but it took them 1 year and they were back in the playoffs. The Rams had one down year and they were back in the playoffs. And they did it with undrafted free agents. So you got to give the Rams scouting department and coaching staff a lot of credit. So to me, they would be the third team to put on this list. And then if I went back in time, I would definitely document how Buffalo did its rebuild when McDermott and Bean took over.
Yeah. I also another major rebuild. I think the Lions are a really great example of this too. Of like,
that would be
a rebuild.
Great example.
Without a rookie quarterback is, I think, a really it's a weird challenge because I could think people realize Jared Goff is a good quarterback now, but back then he was in the same conversations like guys like Derek Carr, right? And I think that is something we really need to kind of process because I remember whenever Goff still had his old contract with the Rams, every single season there was talk about who is the successor after Goff, and then people need to realize the dude's not even 30 yet. He probably plays quarterback for us for the next 7 seasons, right? And I think people didn't really process that. And I think that is also a really interesting way to kind of look at a rebuild because they went 3 and 14 one season or 4 and 13.
Yeah,
and,
it took him a while. I think Campbell had 3 straight losing seasons when he started as a coach. So the Lions is a good one for how to document building it slowly.
I think it was. I don't think it was 3. I think it was bad season first year. Then it was missed the playoffs by a game. Then we eliminated the Packers, and then it was playoff berth. I think that was the order. Okay. And the playoff berth brought us to the NFC Championship game. I think that was the timeline with the Campbell hire. But also for the Rams thing, real quick, I will say a big portion of what made them so effective is that they got some late round superstars like Puka Nacua, ridiculously effective wide receiver. Kobe Turner was in my opinion, he should have been the defensive rookie of the year, right? But it was he's a 4th round pick.
But again, you got to credit the scouting. That's where I'm coming from.
Byron Young, 9 sacks as well as a rookie. I'm saying obviously sacks aren't everything, but those are impactful players they got at late day 2 and early day 3. That's a lot.
We'll do that. We'll do that one. Yeah, dive into that one deeper in another episode. So let's close out the Commanders discussion here. There's going to be at least 2 more podcasts on this channel documenting the Commanders. We didn't get into the Texans in this one. We're 40 minutes deep. So we're going to close out this episode, but we will continue with this. And every day on this channel, there's a podcast on the draft. So my name's Jim. On behalf of NFL Draft Fanatics, thank you very much for listening.